The sun beats down mercilessly on the Nebraska prairie as Thomas Mackenzie drives his wagon across the endless grassland. Behind him, his wife Sarah clutches their infant son, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of hope. They've been traveling for 3 days without finding a reliable water source, and their barrels are nearly empty. This is 1867, and the Homestead Act has promised them 160 acres of free land if they can survive on it for 5 years. But first, they have to find water. Without it, their dream of a new life will die in this vast, unforgiving wilderness. Thomas pulls out a forked stick he cut from a willow tree back in Missouri. His grandfather taught him this technique, passed down through generations of farmers and frontiersmen. It seems impossible, almost magical, but it's worked for his family for decades. He's about to use the most surprising and controversial water-finding technique known to American settlers, dowsing, or water witching, as they called it on the frontier. But dowsing was just one of several ingenious methods that settlers developed to locate water in the wild. These techniques combined ancient knowledge, careful observation, and desperate innovation to solve the most critical challenge facing anyone trying to survive in the American wilderness. How did these early pioneers find water where none seemed to exist? What signs did they read in the landscape that modern Americans have forgotten? And which of these techniques actually worked when survival depended on finding water fast? Today, we're exploring the surprising tricks that settlers used to find water in the wild, methods that meant the difference between life and death on the American frontier. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. The search for water was the first and most critical challenge facing any settler venturing into the American wilderness. Unlike the established communities of the East Coast, where wells and springs were already known and developed, the frontier offered no guarantees. A family could travel for days without finding reliable water, and choosing the wrong homestead location could mean death from thirst or the failure of crops and livestock. The ancient art of water witching, reading the invisible underground, 1800 to 1850. The morning mist rises from the prairie grass as Thomas Mackenzie prepares to demonstrate the technique that his grandfather swore by. In his hands, he holds a Y-shaped branch cut from a willow tree, the bark still fresh and flexible. This simple tool, according to generations of his family, can detect underground water sources that no other method can find. Water witching, also known as dowsing or divining, was the most widespread and controversial water-finding technique used by American settlers. The practice had ancient roots dating back to the 15th century Germany, but it found new life on the American frontier where water location could mean the difference between a successful homestead and a family grave. The technique itself appeared deceptively simple. The dowser would cut a forked branch, typically from willow, peach, or witch hazel trees, creating a Y-shaped rod about 18 inches long. Holding the two ends of the fork with palms up and the single end pointing forward, the dowser would walk slowly across the land, waiting for the rod to react to underground water. When the rod passed over a water source, believers claimed it would dip downward with such force that it could twist the bark off the branch or leave blisters on the dowser's hands. The stronger the reaction, the closer the water was to the surface. Some dowsers claimed they could even estimate the depth and flow rate of underground streams based on the intensity of the rod's movement. The scientific community has always been skeptical of dowsing, but on the frontier, results mattered more than explanations. Families who successfully used dowsing to locate water didn't care whether the technique worked through supernatural forces, unconscious muscle movements, or pure luck. They cared that it helped them find water when their lives depended on it. The choice of wood for dowsing rods was considered critical by practitioners. Willow was the most popular choice because of its association with water. Willow trees naturally grow near water sources and have extensive root systems that seek out underground moisture. Peach wood was favored in areas where fruit trees grew, while witch hazel was preferred in New England and the Appalachian regions. The technique for holding and using the rod was passed down through families and communities, with each dowser developing personal variations. Some held the rod with a light grip, allowing it to move freely, while others maintained firm pressure that would amplify any subtle movements. The walking pace was typically slow and deliberate, allowing time for the rod to react to underground water sources. But dowsing wasn't just about the physical technique. It required a mental state that many dowsers described as a form of concentration or meditation. Successful dowsers claimed they had to clear their minds of distractions and focus entirely on the search for water. This mental component made dowsing as much an art as a technique, requiring practice and experience to master. The accuracy of dowsing varied dramatically depending on the dowser, the terrain, and the local geology. In areas with shallow water tables or obvious geological indicators, dowsing often appeared successful because water was relatively easy to find, regardless of the method used. In more challenging terrain, the success rate was much lower, leading to the technique's controversial reputation. Despite scientific skepticism, dowsing remained popular throughout the 19th century because it offered hope and direction when other methods failed. For settlers facing the daunting task of finding water in unfamiliar territory, dowsing provided a systematic approach that felt more reliable than random digging. Even if the technique didn't actually detect water, it gave settlers the confidence to commit to a location and begin the hard work of well digging. The social aspect of dowsing was equally important on the frontier. Experienced dowsers were valued community members who could help new settlers locate water sources. The technique created a network of knowledge and mutual assistance that was essential for frontier survival. When a successful dowser helped a family find water, the story spread throughout the community, reinforcing belief in the technique and encouraging others to learn it. The tools used for dowsing evolved beyond the traditional forked stick. Some dowsers used metal rods, typically made from copper or brass, bent into L shapes that could rotate freely in the dowser's hands. Others used pendulums suspended from strings, watching for changes in the pendulum's movement over potential water sources. These variations allowed dowsers to adapt their technique to different terrain and personal preferences. The timing of dowsing was also considered important by many practitioners. Some believed that early morning or late evening provided the best conditions for detecting underground water, possibly because of changes in atmospheric pressure or electromagnetic fields. Others insisted that dowsing worked equally well at any time of day, but that the dowser's mental state and physical condition were more important than external factors. By 1850, water witching had become so common on the American frontier that most communities had at least one person who claimed dowsing abilities. The technique was particularly popular in areas where geological indicators were unclear or where previous attempts at well digging had failed. For many settlers, dowsing represented their best hope of finding water in an uncertain and often hostile environment. Reading nature's signs, plant and animal indicators of hidden water, 1850 to 1870. The experienced frontiersman knows that nature provides countless clues about underground water sources for those who know how to read them. While dowsing relied on mystical forces that many questioned, the observation of plant and animal indicators offered a more scientific approach to water location that any settler could learn with patience and practice. Plant indicators were among the most reliable signs of underground water that settlers learned to recognize. Certain species of trees, shrubs, and grasses grew only where their roots could reach underground water sources, creating natural maps of subsurface hydrology that experienced settlers could read like a book. Willow trees were the most obvious and reliable plant indicators of water. These trees require constant access to moisture and will only grow where their extensive root systems can reach underground water sources. Settlers learned that a line of willow trees often marked the course of an underground stream, even in areas where no surface water was visible. The size and health of willow trees also indicated the depth and reliability of the water source. Larger, more vigorous trees suggested abundant water close to the surface. Cottonwood trees served a similar function in western regions, where their presence almost always indicated underground water within reach of their deep root systems. These trees were particularly valuable indicators in arid regions where surface water was scarce, but underground streams might flow year-round. Settlers learned to look for cottonwoods in dry creek beds and low-lying areas where underground water was most likely to be found. Salt grass and other moisture-loving plants provided more subtle but equally valuable indicators of underground water. These plants grew in patches or lines that often revealed the location of underground streams or seeps. Experienced settlers could identify dozens of plant species that indicated different types of water sources, from shallow seasonal water to deep, permanent aquifers. The seasonal behavior of plants also provided clues about underground water sources. Areas where grass remained green during dry periods often indicated shallow groundwater that plant roots could access. Conversely, areas where plants wilted quickly during drought might indicate that water was too deep for most vegetation to reach, but could still be accessible through well digging. Animal behavior offered another set of reliable indicators for water location. Settlers learned to observe the movement patterns of wildlife, domestic animals, and even insects to identify water sources that might not be obvious to human observation. Game trails were among the most valuable animal indicators of water sources. Deer, elk, and other large animals require daily access to water and create well-worn paths between feeding areas and water sources. Settlers learned to follow these trails, which often led to springs, seeps, or other water sources that might not be visible from a distance. The convergence of multiple game trails often indicated a particularly reliable or abundant water source. Bird behavior provided more immediate indicators of nearby water. Certain species of birds, particularly those that feed on insects or aquatic life, rarely venture far from water sources. Settlers learned to observe the flight patterns of these birds, especially during early morning and evening hours when they typically traveled to and from water. Large numbers of birds in an area often indicated water within a few miles. Domestic animals also served as water detectors for observant settlers. Horses and cattle could smell water from considerable distances and would often indicate the direction of water sources through their behavior. Dogs were particularly sensitive to the scent of water and could be trained to help locate underground springs or seeps that human senses couldn't detect. Insect activity provided more subtle but reliable indicators of moisture and water sources. Mosquitoes, flies, and other insects that require water for breeding concentrated around areas with surface or near-surface water. Settlers learned to observe insect behavior, particularly during dawn and dusk hours when insect activity was highest, to identify potential water sources. The geological context of plant and animal indicators was equally important for successful water location. Settlers learned to combine biological indicators with basic geological knowledge to improve their success rate in finding water. Areas where indicator plants grew in low-lying terrain or near rock outcroppings were more likely to yield successful wells than similar vegetation on hilltops or in areas with poor drainage. The seasonal timing of observations was critical for accurate interpretation of natural indicators. Spring observations, when plant growth was most vigorous and animal activity was highest, provided the most reliable information about water sources. Summer observations during dry periods revealed which areas maintained access to underground water, while fall and winter observations showed the most permanent and reliable water sources. The integration of multiple indicators provided the most reliable approach to water location. Experienced settlers learned to look for combinations of plant species, animal activity, and geological features that together suggested the presence of underground water. A single indicator might be misleading, but multiple indicators pointing to the same location greatly increased the likelihood of finding water. The documentation and sharing of indicator knowledge was essential for frontier communities. Successful settlers passed on their knowledge of local plant and animal indicators to newcomers, creating a body of regional expertise that improved everyone's chances of finding water. This knowledge was often specific to particular geographical areas and required local experience to apply effectively. By 1870, the observation of natural indicators had become a standard skill for frontier settlers, complementing other water-finding techniques and providing a scientific foundation for water location that didn't depend on mystical beliefs or specialized equipment. This knowledge represented the accumulated wisdom of thousands of settlers who had learned to read the landscape and understand the subtle signs that nature provided about the location of life-giving water. The Science of Terrain Reading, Geological Clues to Underground Water, 1870 to 1890. As the frontier pushed westward into more challenging terrain, settlers developed increasingly sophisticated methods for reading the geological landscape to locate underground water sources. This period marked the evolution from purely observational techniques to a more scientific understanding of how water moved through different types of rock and soil formations. The basic principles of groundwater hydrology became essential knowledge for successful homesteading. Settlers learned that water follows predictable patterns based on the underlying geology, and that understanding these patterns could dramatically improve their success rate in locating reliable water sources. Rock formations provided the most fundamental clues about underground water location. Settlers learned to identify different types of rock and understand how each affected water storage and movement. Sandstone and limestone formations were particularly valuable because their porous nature allowed them to store large quantities of water that could be accessed through wells. These formations often created natural aquifers that could supply water for entire communities. Shale and clay formations presented different challenges and opportunities for water location. While these formations were less porous than sandstone, they often acted as barriers that forced underground water to the surface in the form of springs or seeps. Settlers learned to look for areas where water-bearing formations met impermeable layers, creating natural collection points where water could be easily accessed. The topography of the land provided additional clues about underground water movement. Water naturally flows downhill both on the surface and underground, following the path of least resistance through soil and rock formations. Settlers learned to identify areas where underground water was likely to collect or come close to the surface based on the shape and slope of the land. Valley floors and low-lying areas were prime locations for water searches because gravity naturally concentrated underground water in these areas. Settlers learned to look for subtle depressions in the landscape that might indicate underground water channels or collection areas. Even small variations in elevation could indicate significant differences in water availability. The relationship between surface water and groundwater became increasingly important as settlers moved into areas where surface water was scarce or unreliable. Underground streams often followed the same general courses as surface streams, even in areas where the surface water had dried up or been diverted. Settlers learned to trace the courses of dry creek beds and seasonal streams to locate areas where underground water might be accessible. Soil composition provided valuable clues about water retention and movement. Sandy soils drained quickly, but often indicated areas where water moved freely through underground formations. Clay soils retained water near the surface, but might indicate impermeable layers that could trap water at deeper levels. Settlers learned to read soil composition as a guide to the best locations and depths for well digging. The presence of certain minerals in soil and rock formations also indicated water sources. Salt deposits often marked areas where underground water had evaporated, leaving behind mineral concentrations that indicated the presence of water-bearing formations. Iron staining in rocks and soil often indicated areas where underground water had been present for long periods, creating chemical reactions that left visible traces. Seasonal changes in the landscape provided additional information about underground water sources. Areas that remained green during dry periods often indicated shallow groundwater that plant roots could access. Conversely, areas that showed dramatic seasonal changes in vegetation might indicate deeper water sources that were less accessible to surface vegetation but could still be reached through well digging. The construction and testing of shallow test wells became a standard technique for confirming the presence of underground water before committing to a permanent homestead location. Settlers learned to dig test holes 3 to 6 feet deep to check for water seepage or to test the water table level in promising locations. This technique allowed them to verify their geological observations before investing the time and effort required for full well construction. The development of simple tools for geological observation improved the accuracy of water location techniques. Settlers learned to use basic instruments like levels and measuring devices to map the subtle variations in terrain that indicated underground water movement. They also developed techniques for testing soil composition and identifying rock formations that didn't require specialized geological training. The documentation of successful water locations created a body of local knowledge that improved the success rate for entire communities. Settlers began keeping records of successful well locations, noting the geological features and indicators that had led to success. This information was shared with newcomers and used to develop regional expertise in water location techniques. The integration of geological knowledge with traditional water-finding techniques created a more reliable and scientific approach to water location. Settlers learned to combine dowsing, natural indicators, and geological observation to improve their success rate and reduce the risk of choosing poor homestead locations. By 1890, the ability to read geological clues for water location had become an essential frontier skill that separated successful homesteaders from those who failed to establish sustainable settlements. This knowledge represented a significant advance in the scientific understanding of groundwater hydrology and laid the foundation for modern water location techniques. The well digger's wisdom: practical techniques for accessing underground water, 1890 to 1900. The final phase of water location involved the actual construction of wells and water access systems that could reliably bring underground water to the surface. This period saw the development of increasingly sophisticated techniques for well construction, water testing, and system maintenance that ensured long-term water security for frontier families. The selection of well locations required the integration of all previous water-finding techniques with practical considerations about construction and maintenance. Settlers learned that finding water was only the first step. The water had to be accessible at a reasonable depth, of acceptable quality, and located where a well could be constructed and maintained effectively. The depth estimation techniques developed by experienced well diggers allowed settlers to predict the effort and resources required for well construction before beginning the work. These techniques combined geological observation with practical experience to estimate how deep a well would need to be dug to reach reliable water sources. Hand digging remained the most common well construction technique throughout this period, but settlers developed increasingly sophisticated methods for efficient and safe excavation. The construction of proper well casings prevented cave-ins and contamination, while the development of effective water lifting systems made it possible to access water from significant depths. The testing of water quality became an essential part of well construction as settlers learned that not all underground water was safe for human consumption. Simple testing techniques allowed settlers to identify water that was contaminated with minerals, bacteria, or other substances that could cause illness or death. The seasonal management of wells required ongoing attention to ensure reliable water supplies throughout the year. Settlers learned to monitor water levels, maintain well casings, and protect water sources from contamination and freezing during winter months. The development of community water systems allowed larger settlements to share the costs and benefits of major well construction projects. These systems often involve the construction of deeper wells that could supply water for multiple families, along with distribution systems that brought water to individual homesteads. The integration of windmill technology with well systems revolutionized water access on the frontier by providing reliable mechanical power for water lifting. The combination of effective well construction with wind-powered pumping systems created water access capabilities that rivaled those available in established communities. "Water is life on the frontier," wrote settler Samuel Henderson in 1887. "A man can survive without many things, but he cannot survive without water." The techniques we've learned for finding and accessing water have made the difference between success and failure for thousands of families seeking a new life in the wilderness. The legacy of these water-finding techniques extends far beyond their historical importance. The combination of traditional knowledge, careful observation, and practical innovation that characterized frontier water location represents a model for sustainable resource management that remains relevant today. In an era of increasing water scarcity and environmental challenges, the wisdom of settlers who learned to find and conserve water using only natural indicators and simple tools offers valuable lessons for modern water management. The techniques we've explored in videos like 7 Winter Survival Skills, Every Frontier Family Knew, and Mountain Men's Hidden Survival Secrets demonstrate that the knowledge and skills developed by frontier settlers represent a valuable resource for anyone interested in self-sufficiency and sustainable living. These methods prove that with careful observation, practical knowledge, and determination, it's possible to locate and access water resources using techniques that don't depend on complex technology or industrial infrastructure. The surprising tricks that settlers used to find water in the wild weren't just historical curiosities. They were practical solutions to fundamental survival challenges that remain relevant today. From dowsing and natural indicators to geological observation and well construction, these techniques represent the accumulated wisdom of thousands of people who learned to thrive in challenging environments using only their knowledge, skills, and determination.